Millions of viewers consumed his manufactured innocence, yet nobody noticed when the machine ground him into dust. The life of Kelly Corcoran remains a definitive Hollywood child star tragedy. Stripped of his commercial value at 14, did he manage to rise from the corporate wreckage, or was he simply left to slowly wither away in obscurity? The trajectory of Kelly Corcoran's life was strictly dictated by the industrial and economic machinery he was born into. The Corcoran family did not enter the Hollywood ecosystem through elite connections, generational wealth, or formal theatrical training. Their entry was purely logistical. It was built on the practical maneuvering of a working-class father operating within the physical boundaries of a major corporation. William Corcoran Sr. was a security guard at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. In the 1950s, MGM was not just a production company. It was a sprawling, self-contained industrial complex. The studio operated like a fortified city, complete with its own police force, fire department, and strict hierarchical structures. As a security guard, William Sr. stood at the gates of this machine. He controlled access. He observed the daily influx of directors, producers, and casting agents. More importantly, he understood the constant mechanical demand the studios had for fresh, reliable talent, specifically child actors. During this era, network television was expanding rapidly. Programs required a continuous supply of young actors to fill out family sitcoms, westerns, and dramas. Children in this system were essentially treated as standardized parts on an assembly line. Studios needed kids who could hit their marks, remember their lines, and endure long hours under hot studio lights without causing production delays. William Sr. recognized this demand and saw an opportunity to generate supplementary income for his rapidly growing family. He leveraged his position, utilizing his daily interactions with studio personnel to advocate for his children. He opened the doors for his older children, Kevin, Donna, and Noreen, placing them directly onto the casting conveyor belt. It was a pragmatic, effective strategy. Donna and Noreen secured roles, and Kevin quickly proved to be a highly profitable asset. The Corcorans established themselves as a reliable, working-class dynasty within the Los Angeles entertainment labor pool. They were not viewed as artists. They were viewed as dependable contractors who delivered a specific required service to the production companies. This system functioned efficiently as long as the family structure remained intact. The income generated by the older children elevated the family's standard of living, creating a baseline that required continuous capital to maintain. However, shortly after Kelly was born, the foundational architecture of the Corcoran family completely collapsed. William Corcoran Sr. died suddenly. At the exact moment of this structural failure, Kelly was just an infant, entirely unaware of the catastrophic shift that had just occurred in his environment. The death of the patriarch created an immediate, severe economic crisis. His widow, Kathleen McKinney, was left entirely alone to manage a household of 8 children. In late 1950s America, the socioeconomic safety nets for a single mother of this demographic were minimal. Kathleen faced a brutal mathematical reality. The cost of housing, feeding, and clothing 8 developing children far exceeded any standard employment opportunities available to her. The financial overhead was massive, and the primary income source was permanently gone. To prevent total financial ruin and keep the family out of poverty, Kathleen had to rely on the only functional economic engine available to her, the Hollywood machine her husband had tapped into. The older children were already integrated into the studio system, but child actors carry a strict expiration date. As Donna, Noreen, and eventually Kevin aged out of specific demographic brackets, their market value fluctuated. To maintain a consistent revenue stream, the family needed new inventory. They needed a fresh face to enter the lower age brackets of the casting system. Kelly was drafted into this labor force without consultation. There was no consideration of his personal aptitude, his psychological resilience, or his desire to perform. He was a biological necessity converted into a corporate asset. Before he could walk confidently, he was being prepared for the camera. His early developmental years were entirely bypassed. Instead of learning how to interact with peers in a standard social environment, he was taught how to respond to directorial cues, how to project a specific brand of manufactured innocence, and how to execute tasks that would result in a financial transaction. The physical reality of the mid-century audition circuit was a grueling gauntlet of sensory overload for a developing toddler. Dozens of children, frequently styled in identical haircuts and heavily starched collars, were packed into unventilated waiting rooms, thick with cigarette smoke and palpable parental desperation. Kelly was paraded before panels of towering television executives who openly scrutinized his teeth, his posture, and the symmetry of his face as if inspecting a show horse. He rapidly learned to read the micro-expressions of these adult strangers, suppressing his natural fatigue to project the exact wattage of artificial enthusiasm required to secure a lucrative callback. The money Kelly generated was not treated as personal earnings. It was not placed into an escrow account or a trust fund to secure his future education or adult life. His labor was immediately liquidated to cover the daily operating costs of a 10-person household. He was not functioning as a child participating in an extracurricular activity. He was functioning as a critical load-bearing pillar in a fragile economic structure. If he failed to secure a role, if he misbehaved in an audition, or if he aged out of his physical appeal, the consequences were not just professional disappointment. They threatened the basic survival of his entire family. This environment engineered a specific type of psychological development. From his earliest cognitive moments, Kelly was conditioned to understand that his value as a human being was directly tied to his ability to generate revenue. His relationship with his mother became inextricably linked to his status as an employee. The standard unconditional support system of a traditional household was replaced by the high-stakes pressure of a management-client relationship. He was placed on the assembly line, fully calibrated to meet the demands of an industry that viewed him entirely as a consumable resource. The machinery was in motion, and the young boy had no choice but to keep the engine running, stepping into a heavily fortified studio system that was already extracting massive profits from his older brother. The transition from a developing toddler to a contracted employee requires a systemic rewiring of a child's psychology. For Kelly Corcoran, there was no baseline of a normal childhood to compare his experiences against. The Hollywood infrastructure of the early 1960s did not accommodate the developmental needs of children. It merely tolerated their presence as long as they executed their required functions. A television soundstage is essentially a factory floor. It is a highly optimized, high-stress industrial environment where time is directly equated to capital. Every minute of production costs the studio thousands of dollars. In this environment, a child is not allowed to be a child. They are expected to operate with the mechanical precision of an adult professional. In 1964, at the age of 6, Kelly Corcoran was successfully integrated into the television manufacturing process. He was cast in the CBS network sitcom The Baileys of Balboa. He was assigned the role of Horace, a recurring character designed to inject a specific calculated dose of youthful innocence into the broadcast. To the millions of viewers sitting in their living rooms, the show presented a cheerful, sanitized narrative of coastal life. To Kelly, it was a daily exercise in labor compliance. The idyllic, sun-drenched coastal marina portrayed on television was an elaborate illusion built strictly inside a cavernous, windowless warehouse, devoid of natural light or fresh air. For hours on end, Kelly stood under massive banks of incandescent studio lamps that generated sweltering heat, required to wear heavy theatrical makeup that clogged his pores and irritated his young skin. He was strictly confined to designated floor areas, completely forbidden from running or playing freely, to preserve the wardrobe and prevent accidental damage to expensive camera rigs. This was an environment where spontaneous childhood joy was treated strictly as an operational hazard, an unscripted variable that threatened the shooting schedule and the corporate bottom line. Operating as a series regular on a network television show requires a grueling physical and mental output. At an age when cognitive development relies on unstructured play and peer interaction, Kelly's neural pathways were being trained for strict repetition. He had to memorize pages of dialogue, comprehend complex spatial blocking, and hit precise taped marks on the floor so the lighting technicians could maintain their setups. If he forgot a line, missed a mark, or lost focus, the production halted. The financial burn rate of the set continued while the adult crew waited for a 6-year-old to recalibrate. The pressure of this operational efficiency was immense. Kelly was subjected to the constant evaluative gaze of directors, producers, and network executives who viewed him strictly as a component of their investment. He was expected to deliver a standardized emotional product on command. He had to smile on cue, project artificial joy, and manufacture comedic timing. He was performing emotional labor on an industrial scale. Furthermore, the compensation generated from this labor did not belong to him in any practical sense. While California had established the Coogan Act decades earlier to theoretically protect a percentage of a child actor's earnings, the reality for families operating in survival mode was vastly different. The legal loopholes and the sheer logistical cost of raising 8 children in Los Angeles meant that Kelly's capital was immediately absorbed by the household's deficit. Raising a family of that massive magnitude in the rapidly expanding urban sprawl of Los Angeles required relentless liquid capital just to keep the lights on and the creditors at bay. Furthermore, the studio accounting practices of that specific era were notoriously opaque, often saddling the talent with hidden overhead fees, steep union dues, and predatory representation costs. Whatever fraction of his paycheck survived, the agents and managers was instantly swallowed by the sheer mathematical gravity of feeding, clothing, and sheltering 9 living people. The concept of personal savings was a luxurious fiction, meaning every dollar Kelly brought home was already spent before the ink on the studio check had fully dried. He was not earning a salary. He was servicing a family debt. Every paycheck he generated from CBS was instantly liquidated to pay for electricity, groceries, and property taxes. The traditional power dynamic of a family is built on the parent providing security for the child. In the Corcoran household, that architecture was inverted. The 6-year-old boy became the sole provider, bearing a financial weight no child could sustain while managed by a mother whose economic survival depended entirely on his employment. This created a highly toxic, codependent relationship where maternal affection was inevitably tangled with professional management and financial anxiety. This precarious economic model relied entirely on the continued success of the television series. But in the entertainment industry, product viability is ruthlessly measured by market data. Nielsen ratings determine the lifespan of the asset. The Baileys of Balboa failed to secure a profitable market share. The audience did not consume the product in sufficient numbers. Consequently, in 1965, after only 26 episodes, the CBS network terminated the production. For the adult actors and crew members, the cancellation was a standard occupational hazard. They simply moved on to the next audition. For a 7-year-old child functioning as a financial pillar, the cancellation was a systemic collapse. At 7 years old, Kelly experienced his first brutal encounter with corporate discarding. He was no longer a contracted series regular, generating a stable yield. He was abruptly downgraded to a depreciated asset. The failure of the show was not his fault, but the economic consequences fell squarely on his shoulders. The family's primary revenue stream was severed. He was thrust back into the volatile, unpredictable machinery of the audition circuit, tasked with replacing the lost income before the household funds ran dry. He transitioned from a stable production environment into the gig economy of 1960s television. He secured episodic, short-term contracts on procedural dramas like Adam 12 and The Name of the Game. These roles were sporadic and offered no long-term financial security. He was treated as a disposable contractor, hired for a few days to fulfill a minor narrative function, and then immediately discharged. The anxiety of constant financial instability became his default psychological state. However, the operational stress of the audition circuit was heavily compounded by a much darker internal pressure. Whenever Kelly walked into a casting office, he was never evaluated purely on his own merits. He was stepping onto a scale that was permanently rigged against him. He was operating under the massive, inescapable corporate shadow of his older brother. The industry demand for familiar risk-free commodities meant that Kelly was frequently dressed in the exact same stylistic mold as his sibling. From the signature tousled hair down to the specific vocal cadence of his delivery. Casting agents did not want Kelly to interpret a scene creatively. They wanted him to execute a flawless technical reproduction of the highly lucrative Moochie persona. Whenever he unconsciously injected his own natural personality into a line reading, the production abruptly halted, and he was sternly instructed to reset and mimic the older template. This relentless demand for replication acted as a daily psychological erasure, cementing the devastating idea that his natural self was commercially defective. Kevin Corcoran, known to the industry and the public as Moochie, was not just a successful child actor. He was an optimized, highly lucrative intellectual property. Throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, Kevin was fully integrated into the Walt Disney corporate infrastructure. He starred in massive theatrical blockbusters like Old Yeller, The Shaggy Dog, and Swiss Family Robinson. Kevin possessed a highly specific, easily marketable cinematic profile, the quintessential, slightly mischievous but ultimately wholesome American boy. He delivered massive returns on investment for the studio. He was the benchmark of success in the child acting sector. For Kelly, this benchmark was a psychological weapon. The entertainment industry operates on pattern recognition and risk mitigation. When casting directors saw the surname Corcoran on the audition sheet, they did not want to discover a new, unique talent. They wanted a guaranteed return on investment. They wanted a Kevin Corcoran clone. They expected Kelly to replicate the exact facial expressions, the exact vocal cadence, and the exact box office algorithm that his older brother had perfected. This expectation established a harsh divide within the Corcoran family. Kevin was the gold standard, the primary asset generating immense capital and cultural relevance. Kelly was the secondary output, constantly failing to meet the operational specifications of the original model. When Kelly failed to secure a role because he did not possess the specific Moochie spark, the rejection was not merely professional. It was deeply personal and identity-destroying. Directors and producers viewed him with an inherent bias, treating him as a defective version of a superior product. This external corporate evaluation inevitably breached his internal psychology. Clinical psychology identifies this phenomenon as identity displacement. Kelly was denied the fundamental right to develop an autonomous sense of self. Permanently tethered to his brother's profile, he viewed himself merely as a substandard replica, a biological disappointment unable to generate the same level of capital. The psychological toll of this systemic comparison is devastating for a developing brain. It breeds early onset clinical anxiety and severe imposter syndrome. Kelly was trapped in an unwinnable operational loop. If he tried to mimic his brother, he was judged as an inferior copy. If he tried to assert his own acting style, he was rejected for failing to deliver the required brand standard. The pressure followed him everywhere. At home, he was burdened with the terror of poverty and the responsibility of the family's survival. In the professional sphere, he was constantly reminded of his own inadequacy when measured against the corporate triumph of his brother. He was a depreciating commodity trying to survive in an industry that only values peak optimization. The foundational cracks in his mental architecture were already forming, long before the ultimate biological disqualification of puberty would arrive to permanently terminate his commercial value. In the manufacturing sector, planned obsolescence is a deliberate strategy. A product is designed with an artificially limited useful life so that it will become obsolete, requiring the consumer to purchase a replacement. The Hollywood child star machine operates on a similar, albeit biological, principle. A child actor's commercial viability is entirely dependent on a highly specific, temporary physical geometry. The disproportionately large eyes, the high-pitched vocal register, and the round, unthreatening facial structure. These are the physical markers of manufactured innocence that the studio system monetizes. However, biology inevitably breaches this corporate contract. Puberty is the ultimate disqualifying event for a child asset. As the human body undergoes natural adolescent development, the commercial product degrades. The voice breaks. The jawline sharpens. The awkward asymmetrical growth spurts destroy the carefully calibrated cuteness that the audience demands. In the entertainment industry, an awkward teenager who does not possess the highly specialized traits of a teen idol is essentially dead inventory. By the early 1970s, Kelly Corcoran was colliding with this biological reality. He was entering his early teens. The physical traits that had made him a functional tool for generating family income were rapidly expiring. The industry's response to this biological shift is rarely a formal termination. The studios do not issue a pink slip or conduct an exit interview to help the child transition out of the labor force. The rejection is cold, bureaucratic, and entirely silent. It manifests in the form of unreturned phone calls. The casting agent stopped submitting the actor's profile. The auditions, which had been the structural rhythm of Kelly's entire existence, slowed from a steady stream to a trickle, and then halted completely. For Kelly, this was not just a career setback, because his entire psychological framework had been built around his utility as a financial provider. The cessation of his acting career felt like a fundamental failure of his core purpose. He was not taught to value himself as a developing adolescent. He was trained to view himself as a working asset. When the market rejected that asset, it triggered a severe internal crisis. He was aging out of the only system he had ever known, and the system was turning its back on him with mechanical indifference. But the slow, agonizing death of his commercial utility was only the precursor to a much larger, catastrophic, systemic failure. The true devastation arrived in 1972. In that year, Kelly's mother, Kathleen McKinney Corcoran, passed away. The true devastation of this loss becomes clear when examining the dual role Kathleen played. In the standard paradigm of a child actor's life, the parent often functions as both the biological caregiver and the professional manager. This creates a deeply compromised ecosystem where maternal affection is inextricably linked to corporate administration. Kathleen was the CEO of the Corcoran family's survival engine. She dictated the schedules, negotiated the contracts, and managed the revenue that Kelly generated. When Kathleen died, Kelly was just 14 years old. The structural collapse of his life was absolute. He simultaneously lost his only remaining parent and the entire management infrastructure that had governed his daily existence since he was a toddler. He was officially an orphan, but the tragedy was compounded by his unique socioeconomic isolation. When a standard 14-year-old child is orphaned, there are social safety nets, educational systems, and extended family structures designed to absorb the shock and facilitate continued development. Kelly had none of these mechanisms. His childhood had been spent on the factory floor of television sound stages, not in traditional classrooms. His cognitive development regarding standard survival skills, academic proficiency, social integration with peers, and basic financial literacy was severely stunted. The studio system had extracted his labor for nearly a decade, but it provided zero educational continuity. The on-set tutors mandated by the industry were often little more than compliance monitors, ensuring the studio met the bare minimum legal requirements to keep the child legally working. They did not provide a comprehensive education. Consequently, at 14, Kelly was ejected into the real-world economy with the educational deficit of a child years younger. He was essentially scrap material left behind by a production process that no longer required his services. It is at this precise historical intersection, the year 1972, that the extreme binary contrast between Kelly and his older brother Kevin becomes agonizingly clear. As Kelly was experiencing total structural collapse, Kevin was successfully navigating the transition into adult corporate viability. Kevin Moochie Corcoran had successfully extracted maximum value from his peak earning years under the Walt Disney umbrella. Because he was the primary earner during the family's more stable period, and because his box office yields were astronomically higher, his capital was sufficient to secure his exit strategy. Kevin utilized his accumulated resources to attend California State University, Northridge. He acquired a formal higher education, the exact developmental milestone that Kelly was systematically denied. Kevin did not merely survive the child star machine. He studied its mechanics and returned to operate it from a position of authority. He transitioned from the vulnerable position of on-camera talent to the protected, lucrative sector of production. By the time Kelly was floundering as an uneducated orphan teenager, Kevin was laying the groundwork to become an executive, a producer, and a first assistant director for massive television properties. Kevin had the capital, the education, and the industry respect to sit in the director's chair. Kelly, conversely, was stranded in the wreckage. He was trapped in the permanent shadow of his brother's executive ascension. The psychological damage of the defective clone paradigm, established during his early casting days, was now solidified by their divergent socioeconomic realities. Kevin was a validated success story of the Hollywood system. Kelly was its collateral damage. At 14, with his commercial value at zero, his mother dead, and his education non-existent, Kelly Corcoran was entirely unequipped for standard civilian life. The protective, albeit toxic, bubble of the family enterprise had burst. He was thrust into a void, forced to navigate the logistical nightmares of adolescence and poverty without a map, without a guide, and without a safety net. The extraction phase of his life was complete. The discarding phase had officially begun. When the Hollywood industrial machine terminates a contract with an adult professional, that individual typically falls back on a pre-existing identity. They have a civilian framework, a network of peers, an educational background, or alternative occupational skills that allows them to recalibrate and reintegrate into society. They possess the psychological tools to process professional rejection as a standard career fluctuation. For a 14-year-old orphan child star like Kelly Corcoran, no such civilian framework existed. He was not an actor experiencing a temporary career slump. He was a highly specialized, artificially constructed corporate asset that had been abruptly decommissioned. When the studio gates closed behind him in 1972, he was ejected into an environment for which he had zero operational programming. The transition from a controlled network television soundstage to the anonymous civilian labor force is a violent psychological shift. On a set, a child actor operates within a rigid, hyper-structured hierarchy. Every hour is heavily scheduled, every action is directed, and every physical movement is monitored by a team of adult technicians. They are the focal point of a massive logistical operation. To suddenly shift from that environment, where one's existence is the center of a multi-million-dollar production, to a reality of absolute invisibility is profoundly disorienting. No one can suppress that level of trauma forever. The structural integrity of a fortified mind eventually fatigues. Oh, financial trust to draw from, and no high school diploma to leverage, Kelly was forced into the raw, unstructured survival mechanics of the blue-collar economy. The child who had once memorized scripts to keep a family of 8 financially buoyant was now forced to sell his physical labor just to maintain his own biological baseline. He drifted away from the Los Angeles entertainment epicenter, filtering into the secondary labor markets of California. He took on heavy, manual, low-wage employment. He traded sound stages for construction sites where the physical exhaustion of manual labor offered a silent retreat from his family's legacy. This phase of Kelly's life illustrates the most cynical reality of the child asset model. The studios had extracted the maximum possible value from his early developmental years, utilizing his youth as a raw material to generate broadcasting revenue. However, the skills required to be a successful 6-year-old sitcom actor, smiling on cue, delivering punchlines, and projecting manufactured innocence, have zero exchange rate in the actual labor market. The industry effectively strips a child of their formative educational years, replaces that education with highly specific, non-transferable performance conditioning, and then discards them into an economy that demands practical skills. Kelly was structurally engineered for a job that no longer existed, leaving him fundamentally unemployable in any sector outside of basic manual labor. The cognitive dissonance generated by this reality is staggering. In his early years, Kelly had a designated parking spot on studio lots. He sat in makeup chairs. He was recognized by millions of television viewers. Now he was an anonymous physical laborer. The human brain struggles to reconcile such extreme polarized realities. The psychological whiplash creates a persistent state of internal chaos. He was forced to reconcile the memory of his high-status past with the grinding, unglamorous reality of his present. This internal chaos was entirely exacerbated by the external, highly visible trajectory of his older brother, Kevin. As Kelly vanished into the anonymous workforce, Kevin Moochie Corcoran was systematically consolidating his power within the very industry that had discarded his younger sibling. The binary contrast between the two brothers reached its absolute finalized state during these decades. Kevin had successfully converted his child star capital into adult institutional authority. He had moved from the vulnerable position in front of the camera to the highly secure executive positions behind it. As Kelly was engaging in physical labor to pay for basic necessities, Kevin was operating as a first assistant director and producer. Kevin was the logistical architect behind massive, globally recognized television properties, including Murder, She Wrote, and later Sons of Anarchy. He was sitting in production meetings, commanding crews of hundreds, and managing multi-million-dollar episode budgets. He had mastered the machine. For Kelly, this was not simply a case of sibling rivalry. It was a constant public reinforcement of his own systemic failure. He could not escape his brother's success. The entertainment industry, which had rejected Kelly as a defective clone of Kevin during their childhood, had now officially validated that assessment in adulthood. Kevin was proven to be the superior, highly functional product. Kelly was definitively the failed prototype. When your primary psychological framework is built entirely around your utility to a system, and that system definitively chooses your sibling while discarding you into poverty, the concept of self-worth is entirely annihilated. Kelly was forced to live with the perpetual awareness that the machine that destroyed his childhood was currently rewarding his brother with immense wealth and prestige. Furthermore, even in his absolute anonymity, Kelly could never fully shed the remnants of his manufactured identity. On the rare occasions his past was discovered by civilian coworkers or acquaintances, he was never recognized as Kelly Corcoran, the individual. He was instantly reduced to a trivia question. He was pointed out as Moochie's brother. His own identity, his own struggles, and his own existence were entirely eclipsed by his brother's corporate brand. He was a ghost haunting the margins of his sibling's legacy. This constant invalidation acts as a powerful psychological corrosive. It wears down the fundamental structural integrity of a person's ego. Kelly was denied the basic dignity of being recognized for his own labor, his own pain, or his own life. He was a man without a country, without a family, and without a self. He was trapped in a state of suspended animation. carrying the psychological debt of a child star without any of the residual financial or social benefits. To survive this level of continuous grinding psychological pressure, a human being requires a highly effective defense mechanism. When the external environment offers no relief, no support network, and no possibility of systemic validation, the individual is forced to look internally for a way to mitigate the pain. When clinical psychological intervention is financially inaccessible and culturally stigmatized, as it was for a manual laborer in the late 20th century, the individual defaults to the most readily available chemical solutions to force the brain's operational capacity to power down. The public is heavily conditioned to expect the collapse of a child star to occur in their late teens or early 20s. The media cycle routinely broadcasts the early onset destruction of young actors, the public arrests, the erratic behavior, the immediate transition from the soundstage to the rehabilitation clinic. This visible, immediate crash is easily consumed by the public as a cautionary tale of excessive wealth and fame. However, the entertainment industry's extraction process also produces a far less visible but significantly more insidious phenomenon: the delayed collapse. A delayed collapse occurs when a discarded corporate asset possesses enough raw biological survival instinct to suppress the systemic trauma of their childhood for decades. They do not crash immediately because they cannot afford to. They are too busy executing the basic logistical requirements of civilian survival. For Kelly Corcoran, there was no luxury of a spectacular, highly publicized breakdown at age 18. Having been orphaned and ejected from the studio system simultaneously, his operational capacity was entirely consumed by the immediate need to secure food, shelter, and basic employment. To maintain functionality in the civilian labor force, Kelly had to construct a massive internal firewall. He had to suppress the psychological reality of his past. He had to compartmentalize the memories of his mother's exploitation, the trauma of the defective clone paradigm forced upon him by casting directors, and the agonizing constant awareness of his older brother Kevin's executive ascension. Suppressing decades of unresolved identity fragmentation requires an immense, continuous expenditure of cognitive energy. No one can suppress that level of trauma forever. The structural integrity of a fortified mind eventually fatigues. When a structural foundation begins to crack under the weight of suppressed trauma, the individual inevitably seeks a pressure valve. In the absence of accessible psychiatric intervention, which requires financial capital and a socioeconomic stability that Kelly did not possess, the individual defaults to the most efficient, readily available chemical solution. It is a fundamental error to view Kelly Corcoran's trajectory through the moralizing lens of addiction or a fall from grace. In the context of his systemic abandonment, his reliance on alcohol was not a personal moral failure. It was the application of a clinical anesthetic. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It is a highly effective, albeit biologically destructive, neurotoxin that temporarily shuts down the brain's higher cognitive functions. For Kelly, it was a necessary tool to force his internal machinery to power down. When the anxiety of being an orphaned, discarded asset became unsustainable, and when the cognitive dissonance of his anonymous blue-collar reality clashed too violently with his manufactured childhood identity, alcohol provided a temporary system override. It numbed the constant gnawing awareness of his own erasure. It silenced the phantom expectations of directors who only ever wanted him to be Kevin. He was not drinking to self-destruct. He was administering a daily dose of chemical anesthetic simply to make the baseline operational reality of his life survivable. But a chemical pressure valve exacts a severe biological toll. The human body is a mechanical system, and when you continuously pump a solvent through its filtration units to manage psychological trauma, the hardware eventually fails. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Kelly had retreated to the geographical margins of California. He relocated to Bass Lake, a small, isolated community in the Sierra Nevada mountains. He secured employment at the Pines Resort, a lakeside vacation destination. The geography of his final years is heavily symbolic of his systemic exile. Bass Lake is located roughly 250 miles north of Los Angeles. It is close enough to the epicenter of the Hollywood machine to exist within the same state, yet functionally, it operates in an entirely different universe. At the Pines Resort, Kelly was not a public figure. He was a staff member. He was part of the invisible working-class infrastructure that maintained the facility for vacationing families. The child who was once the focal point of a multi-million-dollar CBS television production was now executing manual labor to ensure the comfort of anonymous tourists. In this remote environment, the extreme binary contrast of the Corcoran family reached its terminal velocity. Kevin Moochie Corcoran was operating in the highly protected, heavily air-conditioned executive offices of Los Angeles production companies, managing massive budgets and securing his legacy as a television architect. Kelly Corcoran was operating in the background of a rural resort, quietly processing the physical deterioration of his own internal organs. Working strictly as a background hospitality staff member placed him in the deeply surreal position of serving wealthy families who were currently experiencing the very childhood vacations he had been systematically denied. He walked the scenic grounds carrying heavy luggage and maintaining facilities, completely invisible to the touring guests who might have watched his syndicated television reruns in their hotel rooms just hours earlier. This remote environment forced a daily quiet confrontation with the ghosts of his stolen youth, violently amplifying the dissonance between the cheerful boy the world remembered and the broken man currently carrying their bags. The isolation of the Sierra Nevada mountains provided a solid geographical shield from the Hollywood machine, but it offered absolutely no escape from the internal devastation the machine had already inflicted. As Kelly's biological system began to shut down under the prolonged exposure to his chemical anesthetic, a deeply cynical paradox was playing out in the corporate archives of Los Angeles. While Kelly Corcoran, the 40-something biological entity, was living in obscurity and suffering from severe organ failure, Kelly Corcoran, the 6-year-old corporate asset, was completely immortalized. The entertainment industry operates on the principle of perpetual syndication. The episodes of the Baileys of Balboa, Adam 12, and the various commercials Kelly had filmed in the 1960s were not discarded. They were filed in corporate vaults, owned by conglomerates that continued to extract residual value from the footage. The industry had successfully separated the raw material, the child's youth, from the byproduct, the adult human. The studio system still owned the rights to Horace. They still profited from the image of the cherubic, innocent 6-year-old boy. That image was pristine, eternally preserved on celluloid and magnetic tape, utterly immune to the ravages of time, poverty, or psychological trauma. The corporation retained the optimized, highly profitable version of Kelly. Meanwhile, the actual human being who had sacrificed his developmental years to create that asset was left to manage the biological fallout entirely alone. The machine had extracted the necessary data, manufactured the product, and disposed of the hardware. By early 2002, the latency period of Kelly's delayed collapse expired. The decades of suppressing his identity fragmentation, combined with the continuous administration of his chemical anesthetic, triggered a terminal systemic shock. The biological filtration system, the liver, could no longer process the toxicity required to keep his psychological trauma at bay. He developed severe cirrhosis. Cirrhosis of the liver is a slow, methodical, mechanical failure. It is the end stage of continuous cellular scarring, where the organ replaces healthy tissue with rigid, non-functional scar tissue until the entire system suffocates. It is the physical manifestation of a life spent absorbing toxins that the body was never meant to process. At 43 years old, Kelly's internal architecture was finally mirroring the total structural collapse he had experienced externally at age 14. The engine was seizing. The survival tool was completely worn out. Kelly Corcoran's final moments did not occur on a soundstage, nor were they recorded by the cameras that had consumed his early developmental years. It happened in absolute obscurity. On April 17, 2002, in Sanger, California, Kelly's body finally suffered a total systemic failure. He was 43 years old. This final collapse followed a strict clinical chain of cause and effect. Cirrhosis of the liver is not an acute sudden event. It is a chronic, progressive deterioration. The liver operates as the body's primary filtration unit, tasked with neutralizing and expelling toxins. For years, Kelly had been introducing high volumes of a chemical depressant, alcohol, into his system to artificially suppress the severe psychological trauma of his childhood extraction and subsequent discarding. Eventually, the filtration unit was overwhelmed. The healthy tissue was methodically replaced by rigid, non-functioning scar tissue. The biological machinery simply choked on the anesthetic required to keep the psychological pain at bay. When Kelly's heart stopped beating, the contrast between his physical reality and his corporate reality reached its ultimate grotesque conclusion. In the modern entertainment ecosystem, the death of a public figure usually triggers an immediate, highly coordinated media protocol. News outlets push breaking alerts, studios release carefully drafted statements of condolence, and social media algorithms are flooded with retrospective montages. It is a secondary extraction phase where the industry monetizes the death of the asset by generating engagement and nostalgia-driven viewership. When Kelly Corcoran died, the entertainment media machine remained completely, flawlessly silent. There were no obituaries published in The Hollywood Reporter or Variety. There were no press releases from CBS or the syndication conglomerates that still owned the broadcasting rights to the Baileys of Balboa. There was no public statement from the Screen Actors Guild. To the multi-billion-dollar industry that had utilized his youth as raw material to construct its foundation, the biological death of Kelly Corcoran in 2002 was not a recognizable event. This silence was not an oversight. It was a matter of corporate accounting. Hollywood operates as a ruthlessly efficient capitalist enterprise. It tracks assets that currently generate capital, and it tracks liabilities that threaten capital. Kelly Corcoran was neither. He had been officially delisted from the industry's inventory in 1972. When he ceased to be a profitable commodity at age 14, he was permanently erased from the corporate ledger. Therefore, his death at 43 was not a quantifiable loss to the machine. It was merely the delayed disposal of a depreciated asset that had been removed from the factory floor 3 decades earlier. The stark disparity between Kelly and Kevin, the structural dichotomy that had defined Kelly's entire existence, persisted even beyond the grave. Kevin Moochie Corcoran continued to operate within the protected upper echelons of the Hollywood executive structure for another decade after his brother's quiet expiration. When Kevin eventually passed away in 2015 from cancer, the response of the industrial machine was immediate and absolute. He was celebrated across every major trade publication. He was formally honored as a Disney legend. The Walt Disney Company issued official statements mourning the loss of a corporate icon. Kevin died as a validated, highly respected architect of the entertainment system. His life was cataloged, praised, and permanently cemented into the official historical record of American television and cinema. Kelly was granted no such dignity. His existence was relegated to an unrecorded footnote, a phantom casualty of the exact same family infrastructure that had elevated his brother to institutional royalty. The system clearly demonstrated its foundational operating principle. It rewards the optimized product with legacy, and it annihilates the defective prototype with absolute erasure. This divergent outcome exposes the core pathology of the child star manufacturing process. The public is often complicit in this system because they consume the final sanitized product without analyzing the supply chain. When audiences watch a rerun of a 1960s sitcom, they see a cheerful, cherubic child delivering perfectly timed comedic dialogue. They experience a manufactured dose of nostalgia. What they do not see is the industrial extraction required to generate that footage. The entertainment industry does not hire children. It leases their developmental years. It takes the fundamental building blocks of human psychology, the need for unconditional parental support, the necessity of peer socialization, the safety of a non-transactional environment, and replaces them with rigid performance metrics, financial responsibility, and the constant threat of corporate termination. It converts a biological human being into a commercial survival tool. Kelly Corcoran's life is the ultimate clinical case study of this process. He was drafted into the labor force as an infant to serve as a financial engine for an orphan family of 8. He was calibrated to perform emotional labor on a factory floor. He was systematically compared to an optimized sibling, resulting in massive identity fragmentation. And when his physical geometry altered during puberty, rendering his commercial value obsolete, he was discarded into the civilian void without an education, without a support network, and shortly thereafter, without a mother. The system demanded that he carry a psychological and financial load that no developing brain is engineered to withstand. When the structural integrity of his mind inevitably fractured under that load, he was forced to self-administer a chemical anesthetic just to endure the reality of his own obsolescence. The system extracted his youth, exhausted his utility, and then detached entirely, leaving him to quietly manage the psychological fallout in a remote Californian resort. Stripping away the romanticized illusions of Hollywood reveals a stark truth. There are no grand conspiracies required to destroy a child star. The machine does not need to actively plot their downfall. It simply operates according to its own amoral capitalist programming. It extracts the necessary data, manufactures the intellectual property, and disposes of the biological hardware when the extraction is complete. When Kelly Francis Corcoran took his final breath at age 43, the corporate entities that had consumed his childhood did not mourn, because to them, he had already been dead for 29 years. The character of Horace and the smiling, bankable images of his youth remain perfectly preserved in temperature-controlled corporate archives, continually generating fractions of cents in syndication revenue for executives who never knew his name. The intellectual property is immortal, but the biological entity, the boy who was forced to pay the bills, the man who was crushed by the shadow of his brother, the human being who supplied the raw material for that immortal footage, was coldly, mechanically ground into dust.